Hey guys, this is Woodcraft CZ. In this video, I'll be taking you through a mini end grain serving board. I'll be using American walnut and a strip of wood I had made previously comprising of rosewood, zebrano and some purple heart. Here I'm using the miter saw to just rough cut the American walnut I'm using down to size. If you haven't already guessed, I'm just adjusting the depth cut of the Shinko jointer I have. I've done an unboxing and setup video of this, which I'll add to the description. Here I'm just using the Shinko joiner to flatten the face of the American walnut. I'm noticing some imperfections, which I'll have to address later. Now I'm planing it on its side to give it a square edge. So just giving it a once over to make sure that it's good and proper. And now I've taken it to the table saw to cut the other edge so it's square. It was too big to go in my planer. If you're wondering what the yellow block is that I'm using to push the walnut, it's a micro jig gripper. They now have the gripper 2, which I'm later to review in an upcoming YouTube video. Now just running the walnut through the DeWalt thicknesser so it's square all round. I've edited some of these scenes to speed them up because they can be kind of tedious. That imperfection I noticed earlier, it's getting my attention more and more. I've decided to use a dental pick to just clear out some of the loose debris. Now I'm just sizing up the walnut to that mixed block wood that I had made previously. Just experimenting with some positioning of the woods, seeing how the grains match and flow. I've used white chalk to mark the one that I like, so for future reference I'll know how to arrange it. I do think I change it later though. Here I'm just figuring out how thick I want to cut the walnut into strips, using the bench dog's carpenter square to get the measurements right and a calculator to divide it correctly. Here I'm using the micro jig center finder. It's such a simple tool, but it's so beneficial. I didn't realize how much I'd be relying on it and using it in my day-to-day workflow. I'm using it here to set the bandsaw depth of cut that mixed wood that I'd made a long time ago. Now I'm just cutting the walnut into strips. I'm now just getting a feel for the layout and arrangement of the wood. I'm using some chalk to mark X's on the side that I want to be planed, so when it comes to glue up, it's as tight as possible. I have to say I'm loving this Shinko jointer more and more every time I use it. I've got a small shop, so I have to pull it out, set it up every time I want to use it. With previous jointers, I've always been put off by that, but with this one, it's a real pleasure. Now back to the DeWalt. to finalise the thickness and get them all the same. The composite wood I made will be thinner, so I've had to adjust the thickness. Right, I think I need to add a bit more Zebrano. Back out with the Shinko to begin the squaring process. Okay, so something's not quite sitting right. I'm not sure what it is. I'm going to split this strip in two. So now I'm using the micro jig center finder to get the right measurement on the table saw. These add-ons for the micro jig gripper are extra and I've never really used them before. This is the first time, but they really came in handy because the piece was so small. I didn't really want to use the push stick through the table saw through the blade in a really safe manner, keeping the piece secure. Now just using my bench dog stop to sand off any tiny tear out. Right, now time for glue up, and we have a little visitor, as you can see, tiny little spider. I put him on my windowsill so he can catch some flies. Just turning the strips so the glue side is facing up and it'll make it easier to glue up. I'm using Type Bond 3 in my glue bot. It's a water resistant and food safe wood glue. And now just using a silicone brush to spread the glue evenly. Just using a piece of wood to get approximate flatness on the board. Now just wetting some kitchen towel to wipe off the excess glue. I might have used too much glue, but I rather would have done that than too little and have weakened glue points. So I've left it now overnight and returned to it the next day. The board seems to be stuck on the clamps. A couple of little taps from my persuader always helps. I try to always scrape the excess glue on the clamps before I put them away. Now time to start scraping off the excess glue on the board. I'm just using a regular scraper here, but I'll upgrade later. I always try to regularly remove the glue scrapings with a hoover. Now using some bench dogs, the upgraded scraper comes along. It's got a carbide blade, so it really is heavy duty. And back to the blade scraper just to finesse the final parts. Yeah, this is really starting to bug me now, but we're going to fix that later on in the video. Now time to get this nice and flat. I'm using some shims to even out any high spots. Waiting for the glue gun to heat up feels like a lifetime. That's why sometimes I prefer corded glue guns. And systems go. So just gluing the board to this flat panel so it runs through the sander evenly. So just finding the right height for the sander. Normally what I do, I overshoot, run it through the sander and then lower it till I start hearing the roller engage. Okay, so just by luck, I noticed those voids started to fill up with sawdust. I took the opportunity to use some CA glue to just solidify them and stabilize them a little bit. And then using an activator to speed up the curing process. Now time to get the glue gun glue off and run the other side through the belt sander. If you're wondering what I'm doing here, I'm just using a rubber block to clean the sandpaper. I always do this after every use as it just preserves the life of the sandpaper. Now I'm just using my bench dog's T-square to mark the edges square, and I'm using my miter saw to cut them. Looking good to me. Now I'm going to use my table saw sled to cut the board into strips for the end grain. I'm using some calipers to figure out and set the depth of each strip. If you want to see a video on how I built this table saw sled, I'll leave a link in the description and one of those pop-ups in the corner somewhere. Here I'm using the $10 million push stick. These are great when you don't want to get your fingers too close to the blade. And before you ask, yes, that's what it's called. It's not what I paid. Having a little play around to see how the end grain's looking and how I want to arrange it. I did for a moment consider just doing 2 small square blocks. Just getting the clamps ready for the glue up. Now turning the wood pieces to the side for the glue to be applied. And again, we're using Titebond 3 and the same silicone brush to apply it. So just applying some light pressure with the clamps and also using a bit of melamine to get a flat edge on the side. Now I have some HDPE plastic which I'm using to clamp on either side to get a fairly parallel glue up. Just wiping off the excess glue with the wet kitchen towel. And now we wait. So the next day, we remove the block from the clamps and just removing some glue beads from the underside using the chisel. Just using the sanding block to give it a finishing touch before it goes to the drum sander. just using a piece of plywood to secure the board to the flattening jig, and using some shims to even out the unbalances, just super gluing it into place. Okay, so I wasn't recording when I put it through the drum sander, so we're going straight to the table saw. I'm using a thin rip guide to trim equal distances of each side of the board. I had some micro jig push blocks come through the post, so just in time for me to try them out here. I have to say I'm really loving the micro jig stuff, very innovative. Right, and now for the final showdown with that void in the wood. I've decided to go the epoxy resin route. I'm just using syringe pumps to measure out the epoxy resin. I'm doing so in a little plastic cup. It's a 1:1 mix ratio. Just mixing some black pigment with it. I've gone with pigment rather than ink because pigment tends not to spread into the wood. I'm using a tongue depressor to force down the epoxy in certain areas. Now time to leave the board to cure. I'm back 24 hours later, and now I'm just chiseling off some of the epoxy resin, but I'm noticing something. The board's not sitting flat. I'm thinking that overnight it must have warped slightly. Prepping it for the drum sander again, we're going to use it to fix this problem. Now we're just working off some of the epoxy resin. Yep, I'm pretty happy with that. Nice and flat. Now time for the router table. We're going to put some bevels on it and some handles on the side. Funnily enough, when I was making this board I had some offcuts. I used these offcuts to make the stops on my router table fence. They've been missing stops for far too long now. I guess this is what we'd call a little side quest. So I'm just setting up for the handles first. I'm using this router bit to hit the sides to give it a nice sort of bowl cut. I'm just setting the height. And using a caliper to adjust the stops to find the width of the handle I want. I gradually take passes, increasing the height of the bit until the final pass where I just take a little skim off. This helps reduce the chances of any potential tear out. I'm pretty happy with how the handles have come out. Now time to change the bit and do the bevels on the edges. When it comes to putting the bevel on the edges, I tend to do the top bevel pretty flush to the bit, and then on the bottom I raise the bit so the edge protrudes and just puts a very fine edge around the rim, as you can see. just using a sanding block to finish off the edges. Now putting a non-slip mat under the board, ready for sanding. I use a 3M abrasive Cubitron 2 mesh pads. One thing I've learned is that you always use an interface pad between the mesh pad and the backing pad of the sander. It's just going to prolong the life of the backing pad, and interface pads are cheaper than the backing pads. So there's nothing fancy here, I'm just sanding really. I wipe in between grits and occasionally use compressed air to blow out any dust. The drum sander I use has got an 80 grit paper on it. I tend to use an 80 grit pad until the streaky marks are gone. Then I go to 120, 240, 320 or 360, whichever pad I have to hand. Here I'm just using some wood glue on some hairline voids. What I do, I just apply it, and using a sander without a vacuum attached, just go over it in the same grit that I'm using. This puts the sawdust into that hairline void, and then when it dries, it's almost like a cured wood and the void is gone. The sander I'm about to use now is great for sanding at 90-degree angles. It references the top and then sands against the 90 degrees. And here I'm just popping the grain with some water. Now I'm just using a Dremel to clean up the handles on the side. Also a card scraper in the shape of the groove. Now that the water popped surface is dry, I can begin to sand it. In the drying process, it's lifted the grain of the wood, enabling me to take it back down. So when I put the final finish on it, it doesn't do this post-product. Okay, now time to put my insignia on it. I'm being lazy and using a branding iron here when I should really have used my laser. It's a lot cleaner, but hey ho. Now time to prep for the finish. I feel a bit like an edgy Dexter. Let me know in the comments if you got that reference. I'm going to be trying this walrus oil cutting board oil for the first time. Seems to be going on pretty well. And I think now time to see the board in the wild. If you've enjoyed the video so far, please consider leaving me a like and possibly a subscription. It would mean a great deal for me as I'm a young channel and trying to grow. Also, if you'd like to see my work on Instagram, my handle is woodcraft.cz. I would love to see you over there. So I'll hopefully see you guys in the next video. Until then.